They called it justice, but it was closer to theater.
Beneath the dust of 4,000 years, Babylon still breathes a city of smoke, incense, and blood, where the same hands that built the Hanging Gardens carved the first code of law into stone. They called it justice, but it was closer to theater. Every trial was a sermon, every punishment a performance, every scream a hymn offered to the gods. And if you stood in the great courtyard beneath the shadow of the ziggurat, you could hear the heartbeat of the empire law written in pain, order built upon obedience, and fear dressed as faith. This is not just a story about ancient punishments. It is a story about the birth of control, of how one man, King Hammurabi, turned cruelty into civilization, and how his dream of order outlived every god that blessed his throne. His stone stele still stands, black and cold as eternity, carved with 282 laws that promised to protect the weak from the strong. But it was a lie written beautifully. Babylon never sought justice. It sought balance through fear. The laws divided people by class, by wealth, by gender, by divinity itself. A nobleman paid a fine, a commoner lost a hand, and a slave lost his life. Equality before the gods, inequality before the law. The brilliance of Hammurabi was not that he invented punishment, but that he made inequality seem holy. He wrapped cruelty in theology and called it divine order. To defy the king was to defy the gods, and to question pain was to invite chaos. This was Babylon's true genius, the fusion of law and fear. It was a system so elegant that even mercy became a privilege, a favor, signed by the gods and sold by the priests. Imagine the city at dusk, the Euphrates gleaming like a vein of gold, the air thick with incense and judgment. In the temples of Shamash and Ishtar, the priests chanted hymns to balance the heavens. But beneath the music, another sound echoed the cries of the accused, bound and trembling before the crowd. They called it purification. They called it justice. They called it sacred. The people came to watch not because they were cruel, but because they believed watching pain kept the universe in order. Fear was faith. Suffering was holy. The Code of Hammurabi turned morality into mathematics. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It replaced forgiveness with transaction, love with property, faith with surveillance. Desire itself became taxable. A wife was not a partner, but an extension of her husband's estate. Adultery was not betrayal, it was theft. Women were property disguised as devotion, vessels of lineage, bound by laws written by men who feared their own lust. In Babylon, even purity had a price, and when law alone could not control the body, religion stepped in. In the temples of Ishtar, sex was worship and sin at once. Priestesses once honored as divine were later branded as harlots. The sacred body turned into a crime scene, and holiness became humiliation. Every contradiction served power perfectly. The same body that brought fertility to the land could also be used as evidence of blasphemy. Babylon learned to make obedience feel sacred and desire feel dangerous. Every punishment was spectacle. The condemned were paraded through the streets, their crimes announced in hymns. Some were drowned in the Euphrates, others impaled beneath the burning sun. The priests called it balance, the restoration of cosmic order. The crowd called it justice. But what they truly witnessed was fear rehearsing itself over and over, until it became faith. The empire did not need prisons, it needed witnesses. Pain was the language everyone understood. Shame became Babylon's most powerful invention. To be punished was to become a story, a living warning carved into memory. A branded face replaced chains. Humiliation replaced walls. The citizens began to police themselves, terrified not of death but of being seen. The gods no longer watched from heaven. They watched through the eyes of neighbors, husbands, and priests. Babylon had turned fear into architecture, and obedience into instinct. And yet, even in that empire of silence, a few voices dared to whisper dissent. On one broken clay tablet, a scribe carved the question that no priest dared answer. If the gods demand suffering, who cleanses them of their thirst? That fragment survived when cities fell, when temples turned to dust, when even the gods themselves vanished. It is the question that echoes still. For Babylon's fall did not come through conquest. It came through exhaustion. By the time Cyrus of Persia entered the city, no one resisted. The gates opened quietly, as if obedience itself had grown tired. The priests kept chanting. The scribes kept writing. But the faith that held them together had already turned hollow. The people who had been taught that submission was peace simply bowed again to a new master, under the same sky. And yet Babylon never truly died. Its stones became scripture. Its code became blueprint. The Persians, the Greeks, the Romans all carried its geometry of control. The idea that law must sanctify suffering, that order requires fear, that obedience is virtue, those ideas still live, polished by progress, and disguised as civilization. When you look at the world today, our cameras, our algorithms, our rituals of shame, you are looking at Babylon reborn. The river has changed names. The tablets have become screens. But the logic is the same. We still drown the accused in public. We still call cruelty justice. We still watch, and we still believe. So when you stand before the stele of Hammurabi in the Louvre, behind that glass case, I know this. You are not looking at the past. You are looking at the mirror. The stone is cold, but it remembers heat, the friction of flesh and flame, the prayers of the guilty, the silence of the obedient. It remembers the moment humanity first mistook fear for morality. And it waits, as it always has, for us to decide whether we have learned anything at all. The night in Babylon began with the sound of water. The Euphrates moved like a living god through the heart of the city, slow and deliberate, whispering to the walls it had polished for centuries. It was said that the river carried the voice of Shamash, the god of justice, and that every ripple spoke a judgment. When a woman stood accused of adultery, she was not led to court. She was led to the water. The priests stood in their gold and crimson robes. The crowd pressed close, and the air trembled with the smell of oil and burning cedar. The woman's wrists were bound with hemp, her eyes covered with linen. The priests lifted their hands and spoke. If she is pure, the river will hold her. If she is guilty, the river will claim her. And then they pushed her forward into the current. The people waited in silence. If she floated, she was innocent. If she drowned, she was guilty. But the river, indifferent and ancient, claimed both with equal grace. The priests nodded solemnly, declaring balance restored. It was a ritual disguised as law, a performance that replaced proof with faith. The Euphrates had no conscience, but Babylon gave it one. The crowd believed because belief was safer than doubt. To question the ritual was to risk the gods' anger, to unmake the fragile illusion of order. So they watched, trembling, convinced that the suffering of one woman preserved the peace of thousands. Justice in Babylon was never blind. It was beautifully choreographed. Every movement, every chant, every drop of blood had purpose. The priests knew that power was most effective when it looked sacred. Pain, when wrapped in ceremony, became purification. The ordeal by water was not only punishment, it was theatre. The high priest's bronze ornaments glimmered like firelight. The chanting of the acolytes echoed against the limestone courtyards, and the spectators found meaning in the rhythm of cruelty. They were not witnesses to a death. They were participants in a collective salvation. To see pain was to feel cleansed. To doubt pain was to be impure. For women, this law was both cage and altar. They lived inside invisible boundaries, obedience measured by silence, purity proven by submission. Marriage was a contract written not in affection, but in property. A wife was an asset transferred from one man to another, her worth recorded in tablets and sealed with clay. Her body was an archive of lineage, her fertility, the guarantee of inheritance. The Code of Hammurabi devoted dozens of laws to defining her role, each one turning devotion into debt. To disobey a husband was to offend the gods, and to love outside the marriage was to commit theft against heaven itself. The veil she wore in public was not a symbol of modesty. It was a legal privilege. Only noble women could wear it. Slaves and prostitutes were forbidden. Modesty became hierarchy, and even virtue was rationed by class. Inside the homes of Babylon, love was regulated as carefully as grain or gold. The husband ruled like a miniature king. His household, a microcosm of the empire. The priests blessed each marriage with words that sounded like prayers but read like warnings. May she bear sons. May he rule his house. Affection was permitted, but equality was blasphemy. Even tenderness had to bow to structure. To be a good wife was to become invisible. To be seen was to be suspect. Yet the city's control over desire was not limited to women. Men, too, were trapped by expectation. They were taught that pleasure without purpose was rebellion, that to indulge was to risk the gods' wrath. The same empire that turned women into property turned men into instruments of duty. Lust became a liability, emotion. Our weakness, to fail as a husband, was to fail as a citizen. To fail as a citizen was to fail the gods. Babylon's brilliance lay in this. No one was free, not even those who ruled. In the temples of Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, desire itself became ritual. Priestesses, once celebrated as divine conduits, were slowly rebranded as sinners. What had begun as sacred union, sex as worship, pleasure, as offering, became an offense against purity. The temple that once honored fertility became the courthouse of guilt. When the priesthood realized that holiness could not exist without shame, they began to sell redemption. Offerings were recorded like taxes, penance purchased like grain. The body that once connected humanity to divinity now served as the empire's favorite commodity. Babylon learned to tax the soul. Imagine the paradox. In one room of the temple, men and women joined in ritual embrace to honor the goddess of creation. In the next, others were branded for defiling her laws. The same incense that sanctified love was burned to disguise the smell of blood. The same chants that praised the goddess were used to condemn her servants. Babylon's faith was not hypocrisy, it was design. By merging sanctity and sin, it controlled both. Every contradiction was a tool. Every desire became an opportunity for obedience. And still, the city glimmered. Its markets overflowed with copper, lapis lazuli, and spices from lands beyond the desert. The ziggurats reached toward the heavens, their bricks stamped with the names of kings and prayers for eternity. But beneath the beauty lay a silence heavier than stone. The people no longer needed chains. They carried their fear inside them. The priests no longer needed guards. They ruled through shame. When a woman veiled her face, she did not do it to hide. She did it to survive. When a man bowed before the idols, he did not worship the gods. He worshipped order itself. There were moments, though, when the illusion cracked. A scribe might carve a question on a broken shard of clay. Hidden beneath the tablet he was copying, the gods made sweetness in the flesh and bitterness in the heart. Which shall man obey? That line, barely legible, was a rebellion in miniature, a whisper against the thunder of faith. It survived by accident, buried under centuries of dust. Proof that even in the most obedient city on earth, the human spirit still flickered beneath the weight of divine law. But rebellion was not enough to save Babylon. The empire grew too perfect, too convinced of its own order. By turning fear into faith, It built a world without forgiveness. Every act had a cost. Every mistake, a ritual. Every feeling, a rule. The people prayed, paid, confessed, and watched, believing obedience would keep them safe. It kept them silent instead. When Cyrus the Great finally came with his army, the gates opened, not from force, but from fatigue. Babylon did not fall. It surrendered, and in that surrender, the empire's legacy began. For what Babylon built was not merely a city, but a template. Its priests and scribes may have vanished. Its gods may have turned to myth, but its ideas lived on, woven into every civilization that came after. Rome called it order. The church called it penance. The modern world calls it justice. But the bones beneath are the same. Law and fear, desire and control, shame and obedience. These were Babylon's true inventions. Carved in basalt, preserved in blood. As the centuries passed, the river changed course. The temples sank into sand. The tablets cracked and faded. Yet the logic endured, because the real Babylon was never a place. It was a way of thinking, a faith in hierarchy, a fear of freedom, a love of order that made cruelty feel clean. That is why, even now, when we kneel before systems that punish in the name of purity, when we shame in the name of righteousness, when we mistake fear for morality, we are not far from the Euphrates. We are standing beside it once more, watching the water move, believing the current knows the truth, while it swallows us whole. At dawn, the city awoke to the sound of drums. From the temple courtyards to the narrow markets, the air trembled with a rhythm older than language. The priests of Shamash moved in procession, their steps measured, their chants deep and echoing through the limestone streets. Today was Judgment Day, not for the gods, but for a man accused of lying before them. The punishment would not be hidden. Nothing in Babylon ever was. Justice, they said, must be seen to exist. And so, as the sun climbed the horizon, the crowd gathered. Men left their stalls. Mothers carried their children. Slaves paused their labor. The execution was not a secret. It was a sermon. The condemned stood before the ziggurat, his wrists bound in woven rope, his face powdered with ash. He had once been a merchant, accused of cheating customers with false weights. His crime was not treachery against the king, but imbalance against heaven. The priests declared that by deceiving others, he had deceived Shamash, the god of light. To restore order, light would now be his punishment. Torches were lit in a circle around him, their flames trembling in the morning wind. The high priest lifted a bronze rod to the sky and proclaimed, "Let truth burn away to sight." Then the executioner stepped forward, his hands steady, his eyes hollow with ritual. He did not see himself as a killer. He was an instrument of purity. The torches hissed as oil was poured over the man's lips. His body shook, but did not resist. The crowd watched in silence, each person holding their breath as molten bronze was lowered toward his mouth. It was not justice they witnessed, it was choreography. Every movement carried meaning. Every sound, a verse in a liturgy of pain. When the man's scream broke through the chanting, no one turned away. To look away was to risk guilt. To watch was to remain pure. Babylon had perfected the cruelest equation that witnessing suffering could cleanse the soul. The punishments varied: drowning, embalmement, branding, but all shared the same purpose: to perform obedience. Babylon's law was theatre, its cruelty deliberate and symmetrical. If a builder's house collapsed and killed the owner, the builder would be killed. If a son struck his father, his hands would be cut off. If a wife dishonored her husband, she would be cast into the river. It was balance made visible. The people saw punishment not as vengeance, but as symmetry, proof that the universe still obeyed its gods. The city's beauty, the gardens, The markets, the palaces was built upon this symmetry of terror. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders. Merchants sold figs and dates. And priests recited hymns between executions. Pain had become entertainment disguised as devotion. The condemned were not merely punished. They were displayed. A thief was paraded through the square, with the stolen object tied to his neck. A servant who disobeyed his master was forced to recite his offense aloud until sunset. The citizens whispered their approval, half in piety, half in relief that today it was not them. The crowd's faith depended on someone else's suffering. It was a fragile salvation, renewed only through repetition. What made Babylon terrifying was not the scale of its violence, but its precision. Every punishment was administered with the calm of ritual. The executioner washed his hands in perfumed oil before the act. The high priest anointed the instruments of pain with incense. The whip was not a tool, it was a relic. When it touched the flesh, it was said that the gods themselves were striking. Blood was not a stain. It was an offering. Even the screams were measured, their echoes swallowed by the chanting of the faithful. To live in Babylon was to breathe this rhythm daily, until cruelty sounded like prayer. In this theatre of obedience, the people were not only spectators, they were accomplices. Ah, gasp! Each cheer, each whispered blessing turned them into participants. The empire did not need soldiers to maintain control. It needed audiences. The citizens learned that fear could be moral, that watching another's pain was an act of worship. And so the square became the pulpit, and the body became the scripture. When a criminal was branded, the mark was not punishment, it was memory. His flesh carried the lesson for others to read. As years passed, this ritualized violence deepened. Executions were timed with religious festivals, their blood mingling with the incense of celebration. During the spring rites of Akitu, when the king renewed his divine mandate, public floggings and sacrifices reminded the people that purity required pain. Children watched their first executions before they could read their first prayers. It was education through terror. They learned early that mercy was rebellion, that compassion was dangerous, that silence was survival. Fear became the language of loyalty. Yet beneath the chants, a darker current moved. The people began to crave the spectacle itself. The priests preached that suffering purified the city, but the crowd came for the thrill of it. Voyeurism replaced virtue. The condemned's nakedness, the gleam of blood in sunlight, the quiver before death, these became part of the ceremony. The empire had created an addiction to its own cruelty. To maintain faith, it had to feed it. Babylon's temples no longer smelled only of myrrh and oil, they smelled of iron, of sweat, of smoke and satisfaction. Still, the city told itself it was righteous. Every empire does. Pain, they believed, was proof of order. Agony was evidence of holiness. The priests compared human suffering to the myths of their gods. Marduk splitting the dragon Tiamat to form the heavens. Inanna descending into the underworld and rising reborn through torment. To hurt was to echo creation. To bleed was to renew the world. They said this as they watched men die on stakes, as they watched women drown in rivers, as they burned the tongues of liars in the name of truth. But the same fire that purified also consumed. The more the priests demanded pain to preserve balance, the more they needed to invent enemies to supply it. The innocent fed the machine as easily as the guilty. Justice became hunger. It devoured everything: love, mercy, even faith itself. By the time Hammurabi's successors ruled, Babylon was trapped in its own perfection. The rituals continued, but the belief that once animated them had begun to rot. People obeyed, but without conviction. The chants grew hollow, the eyes of the crowd weary. The gods had become bureaucrats of suffering, and their priests, the keepers of a system that no longer inspired awe, only exhaustion. Yet the idea endured. It always does, Because the brilliance of Babylon was not in its cruelty, it was in its logic. It proved that fear could be organized, that violence could be moralized, that pain could be made sacred. The same system that drowned the accused in rivers still flows through the veins of history. Rome crucified. The Inquisition burned. The modern world judges and shames. The theater remains, only the stage has changed. So when you imagine Babylon, do not see it as ruins buried in sand. See it as reflection. See the crowd beneath the temple steps, their faces lit by firelight, whispering prayers as another life is taken. Hear the chant rising, pain is order, pain is light, and then listen for the quiet voice beneath it, the one that dares to ask what no priest would answer. If pain is sacred, who profits from our suffering? That question, whispered once in a courtyard, beside the Euphrates, has never stopped echoing. It travels still, through every empire that came after, through every courtroom that confuses cruelty with law, through every society that builds order on fear. Babylon fell, but the stage remained. We are still standing in the audience. By the time the empire reached its golden height, pain was no longer a punishment. It was a sacrament. The priests taught that to suffer was to speak the language of the gods, and that every cry, every lash, every drop of blood was a verse in a cosmic hymn. In the great temples, stone reliefs showed the myths that justified it. Marduk tearing the body of the dragon Tiamat to create the heavens. Inanna descending naked into the underworld to learn wisdom through humiliation. The priests pointed to these stories and declared that the world itself had been built on agony. Creation required destruction. Balance required sacrifice. In this theology, cruelty was not failure. It was faith made visible. Each morning before the sun rose, the high priests of Shamash gathered in the inner sanctum, their faces lit by oil lamps flickering in the dark. They chanted that justice must burn like the sun, that deceit must be purged by fire. The walls trembled with their voices. And outside, the city mirrored the ritual. Laborers whipped on construction sites were told their suffering built holy structures. Women giving birth in pain were told their cries. Echoed the goddess Ishtar's pangs of creation. Soldiers dying on the battlefield were assured that their blood nourished the land. Babylon had turned endurance into doctrine. To hurt was to belong. To weep was to serve. To die was to be remembered by the gods. This belief was the empire's most brilliant invention, a moral economy that transformed torment into proof of virtue. The priests said that Shamash, the sun god, demanded light, even in the hearts of sinners. And so they made light a weapon. False witnesses had molten bronze poured into their mouths to burn away deceit. Those accused of blasphemy were branded with hot irons in the shape of the sun's rays. To illuminate was to punish. To punish was to purify. Every act of violence was wrapped in the language of devotion. The empire did not hide its cruelty behind darkness. It performed it under the open sky, where pain gleamed like revelation. The priests spoke of equilibrium. They said that without ritual pain, the universe would collapse. Floods, droughts, and plague were described as signs of divine impatience. When the city suffered famine, they claimed the gods demanded more blood. And so the cycle deepened. The more Babylon suffered, the more it inflicted suffering, until compassion itself became blasphemy. Mercy was weakness. Doubt was treason. To question the justice of pain was to risk the fury of heaven. Those who showed pity for the condemned were accused of defying divine order. The law of Hammurabi, once carved to preserve harmony, became the script of fear. It was a theology of equilibrium that fed on imbalance. The priests stood at the top, untouched by the punishments they prescribed. The citizens below carried the burden of holiness on their bodies. In one record unearthed near Uruk, a healer was charged with impiety for tending the wounds of a prisoner. His kindness was called defiance. He was stripped of his tools, branded, and exiled. The message was clear. Compassion could threaten the empire more than rebellion. The system did not need cruelty to function. It needed belief. It required that every citizen accept pain as the price of order. In the temples, suffering was given rhythm. Flutes played as victims were led to altars. Drums beat in slow measure with their breath. The executioner raised his hands, not as a murderer, but as a priest of balance. The people bowed their heads, whispering prayers for purity as the whip descended. The air thickened with smoke and incense, the sound of chanting blending with the cries of the dying. The priests called it communion, the merging of mortal and divine through shared endurance. To witness suffering was to feel absolved. The crowd went home, not horrified but holy. They believed they had seen justice take form in flesh. But beneath that ritual precision, the empire was corroding. The more it worshipped pain, the less it understood meaning. The priests began to invent new reasons to punish minor infractions, became cosmic offenses. Human mistakes turned into divine insults. The gods grew hungrier in their stories, demanding greater offerings. Every doubt required a sacrifice. Every failure required spectacle. The system consumed itself in pursuit of perfection. The priests no longer feared sin. They feared running out of sinners. Among the scribes, whispers of unease began to appear in the margins of clay tablets. One fragment, known as the Lament of the Just Man, describes a servant crying to his God, "Why do you crush the loyal and favor the wicked? My offerings are pure, yet I am broken like clay beneath your hail." The text ends without resolution. Only silence. The scribe's stylus stopped mid-sentence, as if he realized the question itself was forbidden. That silence, the pause between faith and doubt, was the first crack in the empire's perfection. It revealed a truth. The priests could not destroy belief. Sustained by fear, can never endure. Yet Babylon's genius was its ability to disguise despair as devotion. The city continued to thrive, its markets overflowing, its towers stretching higher. To the outside world, it looked invincible. Within, the citizens carried invisible wounds. They no longer prayed with hope, but with habit. They no longer sought the gods' mercy, but their permission to survive. The temples grew wealthier as the people grew hollow. When faith becomes obedience, and obedience becomes instinct, the body may live, but the spirit rots quietly. The rituals that once promised transcendence became mechanical. At festivals, the chants sounded less like prayer and more like exhaustion. Children recited hymns they did not understand, their voices thin against the weight of centuries. The priests still spoke of divine harmony, but harmony had long since died, replaced by a theatre of endurance. Babylon had succeeded too well. It had built an empire so orderly that nothing could move freely, not even faith. And yet, even in its rigidity, there was a strange beauty. The city glowed beneath the desert sun, its towers shining like mirrors of heaven. To wander its streets was to feel the presence of something vast and merciless, like standing inside the heartbeat of a god. The air was alive with prayers, the sound of devotion indistinguishable from fear. Every face was calm, every movement deliberate. The empire had turned human emotion into architecture. It had transformed conscience into law. That is how Babylon endured, not through kindness or conquest, but through choreography. Its rulers discovered that control could be eternal if wrapped in the language of holiness. No sword could enforce obedience as efficiently as guilt. No army could occupy a heart already conquered by belief. The citizens did not need chains because they had faith, and faith required nothing less than their pain. But even gods of silence. By the 6th century before Christ, Babylon's faith had already begun to fade. The rituals continued, but no one truly listened. The gods who demanded suffering no longer spoke, and the priests who claimed to hear them whispered only to themselves. The people still obeyed, but not from reverence, from habit, from fear of breaking the rhythm that had defined their lives. They were free only in one sense. They no longer cared. And when a civilization no longer cares, it begins to crumble, not from war, but from within. In the years that followed, Babylon would fall without a battle. Its walls would remain standing, but its spirit would collapse, leaving behind nothing but stone, dust, and the faint echo of its theology, a faith that had turned pain into prayer and fear into virtue. And though its ziggurats would vanish into ruin, its ideas would outlive time itself, traveling like invisible smoke through every empire that came after. Because once a civilization learns to worship suffering, it never truly forgets. It only changes the words. They called it the ritual of reversal, and no one spoke its name aloud. It was not written on tablets or sung in hymns. It lived in the breath of priests and the silence of courtyards before dawn. It was the most sacred and most secret ceremony in Babylon, reserved for those who had offended the gods so deeply that only their destruction could repair the fabric of heaven. To defile a temple, to touch a sacred idol, to lie before the divine image, to commit the forbidden acts of the flesh inside holy ground, these were not simply crimes. They were ruptures in the cosmic order, and Babylon, believing itself the center of the universe, could not tolerate such imbalance. The ritual of reversal was not punishment. It was restoration. The condemned body became the altar, the offering, and the warning. At sunrise, the priests prepared the temple courtyard. The floor was washed with milk and oil, the air heavy with incense, so thick it made the spectators' eyes sting. The accused was brought forth, stripped of clothing, ornaments, and name. To the priests, this was purification, the stripping away of sin. To the crowd, it was revelation. They saw guilt made visible. The priests recited verses in ancient Akkadian, the words older than the empire itself, invoking Shamash, god of justice, and Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. Their voices were low and melodic, carrying over the sound of drums. Every step, every gesture, every silence followed precise choreography. Even cruelty was organized. Even agony had rhythm. The condemned stood trembling, and the high priest spoke the line that opened every ceremony. As this body is emptied of vanity, so shall the land be cleansed of chaos. With that, the attendants began their work. The first cut was ceremonial, drawn across the chest to symbolize the opening of the soul. Oil mixed with blood and ran in thin rivers over the limestone. The smell was overwhelming sweet, metallic, divine. The crowd did not flinch. They had seen it before. The spectacle was as familiar to them as sunrise. They had been taught since birth that pain kept the stars in balance, that the scream of the guilty was the thread that stitched heaven back together. Women accused of desecrating temple vows faced punishments even more elaborate. They were bound to wooden frames carved in the shape of the goddess's star. Their limbs stretched until the joints cracked like reeds in the wind. The priests anointed their bodies with perfumed oil, not to soothe, but to make each lash glisten under sunlight. Every strike was timed to the beat of the drums. The chant rose and fell. Pain is light. Pain is order. The priests spoke it. The crowd repeated it, and the meaning dissolved into rhythm. When the condemned woman finally collapsed, her blood seeped into the temple foundation. The priests whispered that the soil was clean again. Clay jars of ashes were buried beneath the altar, labeled with the words, "The balance restored." Her name was not recorded. In Babylon, purity erased identity. For men, the ritual was slower and crueler. Those accused of touching sacred relics or defying the priests were impaled on stakes consecrated with wine and incense. The sharp pole was driven through the abdomen and anchored upright in the sand, so that gravity itself completed the sacrifice. The priests remained silent as the condemned struggled, their bodies twisting against the sky like broken prayers. There was no mercy, not even in death. The longer the agony, the greater the purification. When the victim finally fell still, the crowd exhaled in collective relief. They believed they had watched sin return to the gods, carried upward by suffering. To see pain was to feel safe. Every act of violence was mirrored by ritual language. The priest said that when Marduk created the world, he split the dragon Tiamat in half, making heaven from her ribs and earth from her spine. To dismember a sinner was to repeat creation. To watch blood fall was to remember the flood. The empire wrapped every atrocity in mythology until cruelty looked sacred. And the people believed. Because belief was easier than terror, the ritual did not only purify the temples, it purified the audience. They left feeling cleansed, convinced that they had seen the gods at work. No one asked who the gods truly were. Over generations, the ritual of reversal became the spine of Babylon's faith. It was performed for kings and slaves, priests and thieves. Though the higher the status, the more elaborate the ceremony. Power itself became vulnerable to its own theatre. Once, when a high official was caught stealing from the temple treasury, he was made to kneel before the statue of Shamash. The priests cut out his tongue, placed it in a bowl of salt, and lifted it toward the sun. The crowd roared approval. The empire had proved that no one stood above law or pain. What they did not see was that the ritual's true purpose was not justice, it was spectacle. The priests understood that nothing united the people more than shared horror. Fear was the glue of civilization. In time, the ritual of reversal was no longer limited to religion. It entered politics, households, even love. Husbands invoked it when striking their wives, masters when punishing slaves, fathers when disciplining sons. They echoed the priestly refrain, "Pain is order." Babylon had succeeded in turning an empire of bodies into an empire of obedience. No guard could hold a man as tightly as guilt. No whip could wound as deeply as belief. When suffering became virtue, rebellion became sin. But even in Babylon, doubt crept like sand into the cracks of stone. In the archives of Sippar, archaeologists found a fragmentary tablet inscribed by an unnamed scribe. The words are faint, half erased, yet their defiance burns across millennia. If the gods demand pain to live, who cleanses them of their thirst? Perhaps he was executed. Perhaps he vanished into silence. Yet that question is the ghost that haunts every civilization that justifies cruelty as necessity. The priests erased his name, but not his thought. Babylon had tried to make fear eternal. But even fear grows weary. As centuries passed, the ceremonies grew empty. The priests performed them out of duty, not devotion. The chants lost their power. The crowd, their awe. They still came, but not to pray to remember what belief had once felt like. The ritual that had once bound heaven and earth now bound only habit to habit. The gods had been fed too long. Their hunger had outlived their holiness. When the Persians came, they did not have to destroy Babylon's temples. They simply watched as the fires inside them went out. Yet the legacy of the ritual of reversal did not die with the city. It survived in other names, in other languages, dressed in new faiths and flags. The Romans crucified, calling it discipline. The Inquisitors burned, calling it redemption. The modern world shames, calling it justice. Every age inherits the same logic that suffering purifies, that pain proves righteousness, that cruelty can be moral if it is organized. We tell ourselves we are civilized because we no longer impale or drown. Yet we still watch. We still chant. We still believe that punishment makes us good. Babylon's temples are dust now, their altars buried, their priests forgotten, but their echo remains in every spectacle of suffering we sanctify. When a crowd cheers the downfall of another, when a society finds comfort in punishment, when fear is dressed as virtue, we are repeating the ritual of reversal, We are the descendants of that silence before dawn, standing in the courtyard, watching the condemned, feeling holy, and somewhere, far beneath the sand and centuries, the old gods smile faintly, because the ritual never truly ended. It only changed its name, long before chains. Babylon discovered a punishment far more enduring than pain humiliation. It did not scar the skin, it scarred the soul. Where blood dried, shame lingered. The architects of Babylonian order understood this better than any ruler before or after the body heals. But the mind remembers, and so they built a new theatre of control, one that did not require whips or stakes or even priests, only an audience. Public humiliation became the empire's invisible prison, an instrument of power more precise than the blade and more obedient than the sword. The condemned were no longer simply executed, they were displayed. At sunrise, the marketplace became the stage, the crowd its congregation. Merchants folded their stalls, mothers lifted their children, and slaves gathered in silence. The accused was led into the square, stripped to the waist, his head shaven, his eyes lowered. The herald called out the crime so that even the gods could hear: lying, adultery, theft, blasphemy. Each word was a stone, each syllable another lash. The people did not come to question guilt, they came to witness order. For in Babylon, to watch was to believe. The punishment that followed depended on rank, but humiliation spared no one. A merchant caught cheating was forced to stand before the temple gates with a tablet around his neck, carved with his confession. He took what was not his. A woman accused of infidelity was made to sit for hours in the courtyard of Ishtar's temple, her garments torn, her hair cut short, a living warning of what desire cost. Slaves who disobeyed their masters were chained at the city gate with their crime painted across their skin in ash. The people passing by did not see them as victims but as lessons. The crowd's laughter was part of the sentence. The humiliation of one reinforced the holiness of all. This was Babylon's cruelest genius. It taught citizens to see degradation as purification. The priests blessed the rituals with hymns, claiming that shame washed the spirit cleaner than fire. They said it purged deceit, balanced pride, restored divine order. But the real purpose was subtler. Public punishment replaced private guilt with collective performance. Everyone became a participant. The crowd's gasp, the whispered prayers, even the tears of those who pitied too loudly, all of it served the same machine. Babylon's law no longer needed to control people individually. It made them control each other. In a city where the gods saw everything, secrecy itself became sin. The priests declared that truth must always stand in light, that sin thrived only in shadow. So punishment was conducted under the open sun. No curtain, no mercy, no place to hide. The condemned were forced to endure not just pain, but exposure. To be seen was to be condemned twice, once by law, and once by memory. Because memory was the real weapon, a scar could fade, but a story could travel forever. The branded were marked not only in flesh, but in reputation. A burn on the cheek, a symbol on the forehead, a word etched into the hand. These were not wounds, they were scripts written by authority onto the body. To see them was to remember the law. To bear them was to never forget. A branded man could live, eat, and work, but he would never again belong. Children pointed at him in the street. Merchants refused his trade. Neighbors whispered when he passed. Babylon had invented a punishment that required no guards because everyone became one. The priests called it purification. The people called it justice. But in truth, it was control disguised as morality. The more shame was publicized, the more obedience became private. A citizen would think twice before stealing, not because of fear of death, but because of fear of disgrace. The empire had realized something profound, that the most efficient form of power is the one people enforce on themselves. A scribe in the late years of Babylon wrote that a man could lose his honor faster than his wealth, and that honor, once broken, could never be restored. He called it the second death. Archaeologists later found that fragment still legible despite the centuries. A reminder that Babylon's justice had become psychological. The empire no longer ruled the body. It ruled the mind. The citizens did not rebel because they carried the empire inside them. They measured their worth through its eyes. As the centuries passed, public punishment evolved into spectacle. The same courtyards that once hosted festivals of fertility now staged trials of morality. The city gathered not for harvest feasts, but for shaming rituals. The condemned were paraded through the streets on wooden platforms, bound in ropes, dyed red, the color of impurity. Musicians followed, playing slow rhythms as if to sanctify humiliation. Vendors sold bread and wine to the onlookers. Children laughed. Priests recited verses. Pain had become entertainment. And like all entertainment, it required repetition. Babylon's faith had found its most addictive drug, the thrill of judgment. Soon, everyone was watching. Everyone. Servants spied on masters. Wives reported husbands. Neighbors whispered about neighbors. Each act of accusation became an act of piety. To expose another's sin was to prove one's own virtue. The empire had turned gossip into prayer. The priests did not need eyes everywhere. The people became their eyes. The gods, once distant, now lived in every glance. Every suspicion, every hush of conversation. No army could have built such obedience. Shame did what swords. Never could it made people grateful for their own submission. And yet, even within this moral machinery, cracks began to show. There were those who pitied the condemned, who looked away when the whip fell, who wondered if the gods truly demanded such cruelty. But pity was dangerous. Compassion could be mistaken for rebellion. To sympathize with the punished was to question the priests, and to question the priests was to unbalance the world. So the people learned to silence their empathy, to stand in the square with blank faces while their hearts trembled. Over time, even trembling became rare. Babylon had trained them too well. In one tablet found centuries later, an anonymous writer carved a sentence so faint it was nearly invisible. They say the gods see all. I think it is men who see too much. It was the quietest rebellion in history. A single line against an empire of watching eyes. The priest who discovered it ordered it destroyed. But the words survived, copied in secret by another hand. For even in the heart of obedience, someone always remembers that freedom begins with looking away. By then, Babylon was already sinking beneath its own perfection. Its towers still glittered. Its temples still roared with chants. But the people had grown hollow. They prayed not to the gods, but to the fear of being noticed. They confessed not their sins, but their survival. The city that once worshipped the sun now worshipped its own reflection, terrified of the darkness it might reveal. Public humiliation had achieved what no empire before had managed it, made control invisible. No chains, no blood, no war-only eyes. The gaze of others became the new god, and shame its prophet. When Babylon finally fell, its conquerors did not need to burn its temples. They simply inherited its vision. Because once a civilization learns to rule through humiliation, it never forgets. It just replaces the whip with mirrors. By the height of its power, Babylon had learned the most sophisticated art of domination, the art of watching. The city no longer needed to enforce obedience with chains or blood. It had perfected something far more enduring, the illusion of constant eyes. The gods, the priests said, saw all things. From the secrets whispered in the marketplace to the thoughts that flickered unspoken behind the eyes of a sinner. But the people no longer needed proof of divine vision. They believed because belief was safer than suspicion. And so, The fear took root, not in the streets, but in the conscience. Every glance became a judgment. Every silence an accusation. Babylon had achieved what no sword could ever guarantee: the conquest of the mind. The empire's architecture reflected this philosophy. The ziggurat stood at its heart, a mountain of brick and faith. Its peak crowned with fire that burned day and night. From there radiated a network of temples, courts, and patrol routes, all designed like the branches of a nervous system, feeding into a single consciousness. The priests called it harmony. The scribes called it order. But beneath the poetry of their language lay surveillance. Every road led to a record, every action to a tablet, every name to an account. The temples were not just sanctuaries, they were databanks carved in clay. They stored offerings, confessions, and crimes, creating the first bureaucracy of fear. The gods did not need to descend from heaven. Their power had been delegated to parchment and ink. Inside these temples, scribes worked tirelessly under flickering lamps, pressing reeds into wet clay, recording who had missed a ritual, who had delayed a tax payment, who had whispered discontent during prayers. The act of writing itself became sacred. To be inscribed was to be real. To be erased was to die a second death. The citizens knew this and lived cautiously, leaving no trace that might condemn them. It was not enough to behave correctly. One had to appear correct. Virtue was no longer an act, it was a performance. In this world of endless observation, even time became a form of control. The temple bells divided the day into sacred hours, one for prayer, one for labor, one for repentance. Every gesture had its place, every thought its schedule. To forget a ritual was to invite divine suspicion. To skip an offering was to risk the ruin of one's crops, the sickness of one's children, the collapse of one's name. The people moved like shadows through this rhythm of obedience, so deeply programmed that their fear began to feel like faith. Babylon's greatest invention was not law or writing, it was routine. The silent heartbeat of control that needed no king to sustain it. Even the city's design reinforced submission. The streets were narrow and curved, forcing the eye upward toward the towers that loomed like reminders of heaven's authority. At sunset, when the sky blazed red, the shadows of the ziggurat fell across every home, cutting through the courtyards like the edge of a blade. No one could escape its reach. The priests said the shadows were the hands of the gods touching the faithful. The people knew better. They were reminders that even darkness belonged to authority. The system was self-sustaining. Guilt became currency, traded daily in offerings and prayers. The priests sat at the center of this moral economy, forgiving sins in exchange for silver, sacrifices, or promises of loyalty. To be absolved was to be recorded, to be unrecorded was to be damned. In this way, confession became taxation, and forgiveness a purchase. Every ritual fed the machinery of surveillance. Every temple became both a courthouse and a vault of human fear. Children learned this structure from birth. In the schools, small courtyards where sunlight fell through latticed stone, they copied lines from tablets that said, "He who defies his teacher defies the gods." Disobedience was corrected with beatings. Each strike delivered in rhythm with the same chant the priests used at executions. Pain is order. The lesson was not cruelty, it was consistency. The children learned that authority was never to be questioned, only repeated. By the time they grew, they no longer needed punishment. They had internalized it. The whip had moved from the hand of the master into the heart of the slave. To live in Babylon was to breathe under observation. The priests listened to confessions. The scribes documented every deviation. The merchants watched their neighbors, fearful of guilt by association. Even dreams were not private. The temples maintained interpreters of visions, men trained to extract meaning from the night. If one dreamed of rebellion, It was reported as a bad omen. If one dreamed of flight, it meant disloyalty. The unconscious became another field to harvest. No rebellion could begin, because even the mind was occupied. The brilliance of Babylon's control lay in its invisibility. The people believed the gods watched them. But in truth, they watched themselves. The priests no longer needed spies. Conscience was their servant. The empire's citizens whispered their own surveillance into existence, teaching their children to hide emotions, to measure every word, to weigh every gesture. Babylon had replaced morality with paranoia, transforming devotion into an art of concealment. And yet, beneath this harmony of fear, loneliness spread like dust. The same system that united the city under divine law also severed its people from one another. Compassion was dangerous. To help the condemned risked accusation, to question the gods risked exile. The citizens withdrew into isolation, worshipping in silence, fearing intimacy as much as blasphemy. A father avoided speaking too freely before his son. A wife hid her doubts, even from her husband. Empathy became treason. The empire had turned its people into ghosts who watched one another but no longer truly saw. The most chilling aspect was that it worked for generations. Babylon knew no rebellion, nor uprising, nor revolt. The order was too perfect. The belief too complete. The citizens obeyed, not out of fear of pain, but out of devotion to the architecture of power itself. They had become what the priests always wanted, living temples. Each heart a miniature shrine to obedience. The gods no longer needed worshippers. They had systems, but no perfection lasts forever. The same vigilance that protected the empire also strangled it. When every thought is measured, creativity dies. When every act is observed, courage evaporates. When every man fears his own reflection, progress turns to stone. Babylon's brilliance became its prison, its order too flawless to evolve. The city that had once built the future of civilization now built only copies of itself. Its temple multiplied, its rituals expanded, but its soul decayed. By mastering surveillance, it had forgotten how to see, and so, in its final centuries, the empire became a paradox, a civilization of sight that was spiritually blind. The priests still claimed the gods watched all, but the heavens remained silent. The scribes still recorded every name, but the clay tablets grew heavier with repetition, less with meaning. The people still bowed, still prayed, still feared, but their devotion had turned mechanical. Babylon had created a perfect circle of obedience, and perfection, as always, led to collapse. When the Persians came, the watchers looked away. No one resisted. The same eyes that had once judged every gesture now stared blankly as foreign soldiers entered the gates. The empire of surveillance had ended as quietly as it had begun, with silence mistaken for peace. Yet even in Rhine, Babylon's invention endured. Every kingdom that came after borrowed its method: control through visibility, power through guilt, worship through fear. The temples turned to dust, but the eyes remained. They multiplied, invisible now, hidden in governments, religions, and minds. Because Babylon's greatest secret was this: the gods were never watching. It was always us. By the time the last kings sat on Babylon's throne, the city's power no longer came from the gods or from the sword, but from habit. The temples still glowed with torchlight. The priests still murmured their chants, and the people still bowed in the dust at sunrise. But the gestures had lost their meaning. Faith had become choreography. Obedience had become exhaustion. The priests kept their faces serene, and their hands steady, yet behind their eyes lingered the hollow knowledge that the gods no longer spoke. The sacred fires burned not because they were holy, but because no one dared to let them die. The empire had built its identity on divine order, and now, in the silence of its own perfection, That order began to rot. The first signs were subtle. The bells that once rang across the city grew hesitant, their tones less pure. The priests claimed it was the weather, the humidity, the shifting air, but everyone knew the sound had changed. When the hymns echoed across the courtyards, they no longer carried conviction. They sounded like the echo of a memory. The old faith still ruled the body, but the spirit was gone. The merchants still brought their offerings to the temple, yet they did so as one might pay a tax. The people still knelt in prayer, but their lips moved without expectation. Babylon's faith had turned mechanical. Its rituals, self-perpetuating machines that no longer produced awe, only the illusion of it. At night, when the torches guttered low, the city seemed to breathe with weariness. Even the river, once a shimmering thread of divine authority, flowed sluggishly, as if tired of carrying the weight of belief. The Euphrates had long been Babylon's judge, its oracle, its silent executioner. But now it whispered of decay. The priests, terrified of losing control, redoubled their efforts. They declared new festivals, new ceremonies, new offerings. But the people no longer listened. The crowds still came to the squares for the spectacle of punishment, but their cheers were muted, their faces expressionless. Fear had done its work too well. It had drained the life it was meant to protect. In the last century before the fall, the temple courtyards became museums of devotion. Statues of the gods towered above altars covered in dust, their golden eyes unseeing. The scribes continued to record the rituals, but their tablets were filled with repetition, copying laws that no one followed and hymns that no one believed. The ziggurat still stood, gleaming in the sun, but its fires burned low, fed by slaves who no longer remembered what the flames symbolized. Babylon's heart was still beating, but faintly, rhythmically, like the last pulse of a dying god. The citizens began to whisper that the gods had abandoned them. The priests responded with threats, claiming that doubt itself was sin, that the gods tested them through silence. But even they began to falter, late at night. Some priests confessed to each other that they no longer dreamed of light. They dreamed of emptiness, of temples without worshippers, of rivers without voices. They were terrified, not of death, but of meaninglessness. To lose faith in the gods was to lose Babylon itself. For the city and its divinities were one. The empire had bound its identity so tightly to its theology that when the gods began to fade, the city's foundation cracked. And yet, the collapse was quiet. No rebellions, no fires, no cries of defiance, only stillness. The people continued to work, to trade, to build. The market still bustled. The gardens still bloomed. The soldiers still patrolled the gates. On the surface, nothing had changed, but beneath it all, the pulse of belief had stopped. The empire's obedience persisted, but not out of devotion. It endured out of inertia. Babylon had become a city that worshipped its own routine. The priests still spoke of order, but they were now custodians of a myth that no longer inspired. Their authority depended on fear, but fear itself was losing power. It had become a dull ache rather than a sharp pain, something people endured without noticing. When Cyrus of Persia came with his army, he did not need to fight. The walls of Babylon, once symbols of divine protection, were opened from within. The soldiers entered under torchlight to find the streets empty, the temples silent. The priests greeted them with trembling smiles, offering blessings in the name of gods who no longer answered. The conquest was bloodless, a surrender wrapped in ceremony. Babylon did not fall by force, it collapsed from fatigue. The Persians, wise in victory, promised to honor its temples and preserve its faith. The priests bowed gratefully, never realizing that this mercy was the final act of their undoing. For when a belief must be protected by its conquerors, it is already dead. The city lingered for centuries, its rituals preserved like fossils, its laws copied and translated by empires that admired its order, but not its soul. The Persians borrowed its bureaucracy, the Greeks borrowed its astrology, the Romans borrowed its justice. Each successor claimed to be more enlightened, more humane, more civilized. Yet each carried Babylon's logic within them, the conviction that control is sacred, that obedience is moral, that suffering is the price of order. The city's ruins became the foundation of new empires, and through them, its ghosts spread. Archaeologists would one day unearth its temples and find clay tablets still marked with prayers to silent gods. The handwriting delicate, almost human in its doubt. Shamash, see me. I've done no wrong. Beneath the words, the scribe had scratched a faint line, barely visible. The gods no longer hear. It was not rebellion, only resignation. Babylon's citizens had not lost faith in divinity. They had lost faith in themselves. They had built a perfect world and discovered that perfection is a kind of death. In time, the river shifted its course, abandoning the city like a lover who could no longer bear its silence. The gardens withered. The ziggurat crumbled. Sand buried the streets where processions once marched. The empire that had taught the world to worship order was swallowed by chaos, as all empires are. And yet, even in Rhine, Babylon did not vanish. Its lessons survived in marble, in parchment, in memory. The Code of Hammurabi became the skeleton of every future law. The rituals of shame became the moral backbone of every faith that demanded purity. The surveillance of the gods became the conscience of man. The city had died, but its architecture remained rebuilt endlessly in hearts, in nations, in systems that still whisper the same promise: obey, and you will be safe. And so the ruins of Babylon stand not as monuments of stone, but as mirrors of the mind. To walk among them is to hear an echo older than time, the chant of a people who believed that obedience could make them divine, that suffering could buy peace, that silence could preserve truth. Their temples may be gone, but their idea of holiness, this fusion of fear and virtue, has never left us. Babylon fell, but the world it imagined still breathes. Every time a law justifies cruelty, every time order demands submission, every time faith becomes a mask for control, the old city rises again in shadow. Because Babylon's end was not its death, it was its beginning. It did not crumble beneath the weight of its enemies, but beneath the gravity of its own perfection. And perfection, when built on fear, is nothing more than a slow collapse. Its walls are gone, but its logic remains, drifting like dust through every empire that came after, whispering to the living what the dead already know, that once fear becomes faith, the gods no longer rule us. We rule ourselves and call it worship. When the torches of Babylon finally dimmed, the fire did not die, it simply changed hands. The conquerors who inherited the city also inherited its logic. Cyrus, Alexander, Caesar, they did not destroy the Babylonian idea. They perfected it. For what Babylon created was not merely a city of stone, but a way of thinking that could survive any fall. The belief that order is divine, that obedience preserves the world, and that fear is the cleanest form of loyalty. These ideas crossed deserts and oceans, dressed themselves in new languages and new gods, and built empires that all claimed to be different, yet whispered the same prayer beneath their banners. Every civilization since has carried a trace of that old geometry. The invisible architecture of control carved into law, faith, and conscience. In Greece, the philosophers traded tablets for scrolls, but kept the Babylonian symmetry intact. They called it reason instead of divinity. But their logic was familiar. The universe had order, and man's virtue was to submit to it. They built temples of marble instead of mud. Yet the gods who watched from above still demanded hierarchy. The citizen obeyed the polis as once he had obeyed Shamash. The laws were written by men but sanctified by the illusion that they reflected something cosmic, eternal, beyond questioning. Plato's Republic was only Hammurabi's dream rewritten in the language of intellect, the perfect state, ruled by the wise, regulated by order, guarded by the same ancient fear that chaos would swallow the world if obedience ever wavered. Then came Rome, the empire that turned obedience into an art. Its roads and aqueducts stretched across continents, each brick laid in the name of discipline. Rome inherited Babylon's body and baptized it in blood. The emperor replaced the priest, the Senate replaced the temple, but the rituals remained. The public punishments, the spectacles of pain, the chants of loyalty echoing through marble arches. It was Babylon reborn under another sun. The Roman jurists, with their meticulous codes, called it justice. But they knew what they were building. They built a world where law was sacred, where punishment was spectacle, where the citizen's worth was defined by his submission to the empire. Every crucifixion was a sermon. Every parade of the condemned was a hymn to order. The gods of Rome might have worn laurel wreaths, but their hearts were still carved from Babylonian stone. And when Rome's fires cooled, another empire rose from its ashes. Cloaked not in bronze but in faith, the church inherited the same architecture of power and renamed it salvation. The priests no longer served Shamash or Marduk. They served the one true God. Yet their methods were ancient. They built cathedrals instead of ziggurats, wrote scriptures instead of tablets. But still they spoke of light and punishment, purity and sin. They baptized suffering as redemption. They called submission virtue. The old ritual of obedience returned in softer robes: confession, penance, atonement. The public square became the pulpit. The brand became the cross. The ritual of reversal became the Inquisition. The language of cruelty changed, but its rhythm remained the same. Humanity was still taught that pain purifies, that disobedience invites ruin, that to doubt authority is to endanger the soul. And so the centuries passed, and Babylon's voice echoed through every throne room and altar. Through the edicts of kings and the laws of nations, the Enlightenment came, bringing light once more. But even that light had a shadow. Reason became the new god, order its prophet. Governments that claimed to liberate men instead bound them in systems just as invisible and unyielding. Surveillance replaced sacrifice. The public square became the court. The priest became the bureaucrat. The chant became paperwork. Humanity had learned to police itself so efficiently that it no longer needed gods or whips. It had morality and law. Babylon's chain had become internal. Yet in every age, there were those who noticed the pattern. The poets, the philosophers, the rebels. They saw the same geometry: repeated law, sanctified by fear, faith traded for submission, conscience reshaped by power. They wrote of freedom, but even their words were haunted by Babylon's vocabulary. To speak of justice was to use the language of the lawgiver. To speak of morality was to borrow the tone of the priest. Babylon had colonized not only history but the mind. Even rebellion followed its grammar. The reformer preached righteousness. The revolutionary demanded order through a different flag. And always, behind the mask of progress, the same old voice whispered, "Obey, or perish." In the modern world, the river returned under a different name. It flowed through screens and cameras, through borders and databases. The gods no longer spoke from the sky. They glowed from within machines. Where Hammurabi once carved laws in stone, we now carve them in code. Where priests once recorded confessions on clay, we now store them in clouds. The surveillance of Babylon has become digital. The courtyards have become networks. The trials are held in public again. broadcast not by heralds but by algorithms. The crowd gathers not in temples, but on screens, their faces lit by artificial fire, watching the condemned fall in real time. Every humiliation goes viral. Every downfall becomes a ritual. We call it accountability, as they once called it purification. But the pattern is the same. Babylon never left it evolved. Modern societies worship new idols: security, progress, productivity, yet they demand the same sacrifice. We trade freedom for safety, privacy for peace, conscience for belonging. We still kneel. Though we no longer realize it, we still believe the river knows who is guilty. Though the river now runs through fiber optics instead of stone canals. We have rebuilt the ziggurat out of glass and steel, each tower gleaming like a prayer to invisible gods of data. And still, beneath the hum of machines, the old hymn persists: order through fear, virtue through control. If you stand in the Louvre today and gaze upon Hammurabi's stele, the stone seems lifeless, trapped behind glass. But look closer. The carving of the king receiving the rod and ring from Shamash, god of justice, glows faintly under the lights. His eyes are lifted toward the divine, his posture perfect, his message eternal. That image has survived every empire, every revolution, every religion. It is the seed of all authority. The moment humanity learned to kneel before its own reflection, justice, carved in stone, fear, sanctified as faith. And perhaps that is the true immortality of Babylon. Not its towers, not its gardens, not its conquests, but its idea. That civilization must be built upon control. That peace must be purchased in obedience. That suffering can be holy if it is orderly. Every empire since has believed it, and in believing, has rebuilt Babylon brick by invisible brick. The names of the gods have changed, but their hunger has not. They still demand devotion. They still promise balance. They still whisper the same bargain: surrender your freedom, and you will be safe. The ruins along the Euphrates are silent now, but their silence is deceptive. Beneath the dust, the same pattern sleeps, waiting for new architects to awaken it. And they will, as they always have, mistaking repetition for progress, calling old fear by new names. Babylon's river never dried. It only changed its course. It flows through our institutions, our courts, our screens. It flows through us. And as long as humanity believes that obedience is peace, the current will never stop. The ruins of Babylon still lie beneath the desert sun. But time has not erased the shape of its logic. Wind has worn the bricks smooth. Sand has swallowed its temples. Yet something invisible endures the blueprint of obedience. Etched not in stone but in the human mind. It is there, in the pulse of every law that justifies itself through punishment, in every faith that confuses suffering with virtue, in every government that promises safety in exchange for silence. The city may have fallen, but its echo governs the living. We do not call it Babylon anymore. We call it civilization. In museums, tourists stand before Hammurabi's black stele and admire it as a relic of progress. They see humanity's first written code of law, the dawn of justice, the moment reason triumphed over chaos. They rarely read the words. They rarely notice that beneath the carved relief of the king and the god, the laws themselves are a litany of cruelty, written with the precision of worship. A hand for a hand, an eye for an eye, a life for a law. They do not see that the monument is not just a record of civilization's birth, it is also its confession. The first time we called punishment holy, the first time we mistook fear for order, the first time we built peace upon submission, modern life has changed its language, but not its soul. We still carve our laws in the same geometry. Only now the stone is digital, and the gods are algorithms. We have built new temples that hum with electricity instead of prayer, and we bow before them with the same reverence. Cameras stare where idols once stood. Data replaces the river as the judge of purity. The rituals have become bureaucratic, invisible, efficient, but their purpose is the same: to make obedience feel moral, to make control look natural, to make the watchers invisible until we become them ourselves. We speak of freedom, yet carry devices that track our movements. We speak of transparency, yet fear being seen. We are the citizens of a new Babylon, built not from clay and fire, but from attention and guilt. And just like the old empire, ours thrives on spectacle. We no longer gather in courtyards to watch punishment. We scroll, we refresh, we judge. Public shaming has returned, sharper and faster than ever before. Once, the condemned stood before the temple. Now they stand before the screen. The crowd does not chant with their voices, but with their clicks. Each accusation spreads like incense smoke, curling through the air until it chokes us all. We call it justice. We call it accountability. But beneath the glow of our devices, the ancient pattern repeats: pain as purification, humiliation as virtue, obedience as belonging. Babylon's theology lives on in our reflex to destroy, to display, to sanctify cruelty by calling it necessary. Perhaps the greatest illusion is that we believe we have outgrown it. We no longer invoke gods to explain our hierarchies. We invoke reason, science, security. We say we are rational, enlightened, free. Yet the logic is identical. Our systems reward submission. Our institutions protect power by calling it order. Our morality still measures virtue by how well we obey the invisible rules of the crowd. We do not fear divine wrath. We fear exclusion. We do not dread judgment from the heavens. We dread indifference. The gods have changed form, but their hunger remains. They feed now on our attention, our compliance, our silence, and, like the citizens of old Babylon, we confuse stillness with peace. We follow the rhythm of our routines, the schedules, the screens, the endless transactions, and tell ourselves the world is stable because it is predictable. But under that quiet surface lies the same exhaustion that once hollowed the temples of the Euphrates. The cost of constant vigilance, of constant virtue, of constant visibility, is the same in every age. The slow erosion of the soul. We police ourselves, measure our words, curate our lives until no rebellion remains even in thought. The empire no longer needs guards. It has taught us to guard ourselves. History, it seems, never forgets its first story. Babylon's logic has migrated across time, wearing every civilization like a mask. It hid in the marble of Rome, in the incense of cathedrals, in the parchment of kings, and now, in the light of our screens, it whispers that the world would fall without control, that safety is worth the surrender of freedom, that obedience is the highest form of faith. It tells us that fear keeps us moral. And because we are still afraid of chaos, we listen. We rebuild the ziggurat every generation, higher and higher, convinced that this time it will reach heaven. But heaven, as always, remains silent. And yet, there is a quiet defiance that even Babylon could never erase. It lives in the unrecorded gestures, the small mercies, the unseen kindnesses, the moments of disobedient empathy that slip through the cracks of every system. The slave who helped another escape, the scribe who wrote forbidden truths in the margins, the modern whistleblower who exposes corruption knowing they will be condemned. These are the people who break the rhythm, who remind us that order built on fear is not harmony but paralysis, that a law which demands suffering is not justice but theatre. That true civilization begins only when compassion becomes louder than obedience. The ruins of Babylon are not merely a warning, they are a mirror. They show us what happens when perfection becomes more important than mercy, when purity is valued more than love, when law forgets why it was written. Every empire that worships itself eventually becomes a tomb. Every civilization that demands obedience without conscience ends buried beneath the same dust. It once believed itself above. The priests of Babylon thought they had conquered chaos forever, but the only eternal thing they built was their mistake. And so, we must ask the question that their silence never answered. The same question carved secretly by that forgotten scribe, thousands of years ago. If the gods demand suffering, who cleanses them of their thirst? In that question lies the boundary between civilization and barbarism, between faith and fear. It is the question that ends empires and begins humanity. The desert wind still moves over the ruins, carrying the echo of prayers. The sound of water long vanished. The faint ghost of voices that once believed they were eternal. Babylon's shadow stretches farther than any empire's reach. But it is not unbreakable. The moment we see its shape within ourselves, the moment we recognize that obedience is not holiness, that justice cannot be carved in stone, that no god deserves worship built on pain, that is the moment the river finally runs free. Because Babylon did not fall once, it falls every day we choose conscience over control, mercy over spectacle, truth over fear. It falls whenever someone dares to speak, to doubt, to love without permission. The empire of obedience lives only as long as we kneel. And when we stand, when we stop mistaking fear for faith, the ruins will cease to be warnings. They will become the beginning of something that Babylon, for all its brilliance, never imagined: a civilization that remembers its gods, but worships none.